Hello once again. We're going to spend a bit of time for this lesson kind of looking at where we are in the 2020 presidential election. The election itself is taking place in November, and there are a lot of elections that are taking place at this particular point in time. For Texas alone, one of our one of our federal senators is up for re-election. Our U.S. House of Representatives, all of our all of our Texas state senators, a whole bunch of our Texas state senators are up for re-election. There's a lot going on, and so right now, or rather for today, we're really just going to focus in on the presidential election. That one garners a whole lot of attention. So I wanted to kind of at least make sure that you're up to speed on some of the processes that has taken place that have led to the two candidates that we've got for the 2020 election itself. Once again, a few kind of review slides, right? Political parties are going to be heavily involved in this. Parties themselves are expecting that the 2020 presidential election alone will cost upwards of $1 billion when all is said and told, between the ad buys and the everything else that the donations and the this, that, and the other, the salaries and just everything. So huge, massive amounts of money. We're going to dive into the costs of elections in a later lecture, but parties themselves very, very heavily involved, and what we're looking at this point is, again, just this first step in the process, because if you want to be able to accomplish any of the other three, you got to win an election. And the most visible of elections in the United States today is that for the presidency. This is this is relatively unusual for the totality of America's history, right? Most of American history, it's been states that had a lot of the authority, and Congress that exercised a lot of authority at the federal level. But that's changed a lot in the past, I don't know, 80 years or so. Um, so now the president has a big hand when it comes to the federal government as a whole, and laws all across America as a whole. So this particular candidate, while it's only one office, it's one person, gets so much attention here in America for the reasons I just mentioned, and also in the rest of the world because of America's place economically, socially, militarily, all across the globe. And it's the president who is the face of all of America to the rest of the globe. We looked in a previous lesson on why we have these elections, and I'm just going to highlight this last one again. Right, elections are our way to influence the government, and our way to get our voices heard, our insights shared, to put weight behind this ideology as opposed to all other ideologies, this person as opposed to all other persons. It's really the closest, most direct, clearest way that you and I can get involved in the government, whether it's the federal, the state, local governments. This is how most people do it. We've also talked about the different kinds of elections. We have primaries and caucuses. We've talked about runoffs, and then also the general election. So the build up to the November 2020 election is consists of a lot of primaries and caucuses, and where necessary, runoff elections as well. And we looked at this schedule of primaries and caucuses that have taken place and will continue taking place up to the actual November election. Each of these different parties, they are in charge of their own primaries and their own caucuses, their own runoffs. And so in Texas, right, you kind of tell them which of the two parties you would like to vote for, and you vote for candidates of that party for all these different instances. So here we see the Democratic primary for our U.S. Senate seat, the Republican primary for that same seat, right? Again, these are taking place separately from one another. The Democratic side, there was no clear-cut winner, and so we had to have a runoff between the two highest vote getters, and here we see Mary Hagar and Royce West going head to head, and Mary Hagar taking that election. For the House seats, that is the representative for the San Jacinto area. Pete Olson, again, you'll recall he's the incumbent. He currently is in office, but he is not seeking re-election in November. And so as a result, both seats are up for grabs. We are going to see who will win here. The Democratic Street took 53% of the overall primary election results. So she was the Democratic nominee. On the Republican side, nobody got a 50% majority. So even though one candidate got twice as much as the second place candidate, well, you still have to go to a runoff. And in the runoff, we see the results here. Troy Niels took that one. Let me back up a little bit. A lot of focus and attention was given to this one day in particular, March 3rd, as Super Tuesday. This is one day where a bunch of states all come together for a variety of reasons and say, let's have our primaries all on this one day. And there's a lot of history behind this approach to things. So we'll get a video going here in just a moment to provide some of that and get a few graphics in there as well to help kind of break down what Super Tuesday itself is. But that's what we went through just a few months ago. So now let's get that thing running.
In December of 2007, a U.S. Senator named Barack Obama was running for president. It didn't look like he would beat the well-known frontrunner, Hillary Clinton. She was nearly 20 points ahead of him in the national polls. But then, 1 month later,
a huge victory.
Obama won the Iowa caucus. The Iowa caucus is like an election, but instead of voting in a voting booth, you stand with other people to be counted. It's weird. But it's also the very first contest in America's presidential primary process to determine the two major parties' nominees. And if you win it, it's a big deal.
You have done what the cynics said we couldn't do.
Literally overnight, Obama shot up in the polls. Winning Iowa turned him from a long-shot candidate to a real possibility. For the last 50 years, Iowa has been a hugely influential part of the presidential primary system. But in 2020, well...
epic failure.
Meltdown of the vote reporting system.
First, a bunch of technical mishaps delayed the caucus results. Then when the results came out, no one was actually sure if they were correct. And it started to raise questions about whether the Iowa caucus deserves to be so important. The way America's political parties choose their presidential nominees, starting in Iowa and then with 63 other elections on 21 separate days, was kind of set up quickly and without any real thought behind the order. So why do we choose presidents this way? And is there a better way to do it? To understand how we do things now, you have to go back about 50 years. As recently as the 60s, only a few states even held primaries. Most states didn't, and party leaders would just pick the presidential nominee at the convention.
Voters were much more divorced from the process than they are today.
This is Lee. She's been covering the 2020 primaries for Vox.
At that time, the people in charge were effectively picking the people that would stay in charge.
Which mostly worked fine until 1968. In the few primaries that year, young Democrats voted in big numbers for candidates who were against the Vietnam War. But at the convention, the party delegates instead chose the pro-war vice president, who wasn't even on the ballot in the few states that actually held primaries. It did not go over well.
The gas is being spread, it's coming this way, and it's awful.
There was huge pushback to that. The protests were incredibly effective and actually ended up in the changes that we see now.
What changed was the Democratic Party decided to let voters pick the nominee, with elections in each state. Republicans soon followed suit. Today, the delegates from each state still officially vote on the nominee at the convention.
Arizona delivers 58 bound votes.
But they have to vote according to how the candidates did in their state primaries. To win the nomination, a candidate needs a majority of all the delegates. And big states with big populations, like Florida, have lots of delegates for the taking. Small states like Iowa have just a few. But even though it's not a delegate powerhouse, in the sequential primary system, Iowa has a crucial job, as do other small states that vote early in the process. Let's look at the 2016 Republican primary as an example. When the Iowa caucus kicked things off, there were 12 serious candidates on the ballot. After Iowa, 3 immediately dropped out. And after the New Hampshire primary a week later, 3 more dropped out. This is what those early states are there to do.
The early states end up winnowing the field to a slate of what people might consider frontrunners. They help candidates generate hype, press coverage, additional donations.
In other words, instead of the rest of the country having to choose between 12 candidates, early states help the party narrow down its options to just a few viable candidates for the rest of the primaries. That also gives voters in these early states a lot of power. A voter in the earliest state has 5 times the influence on deciding the nominee as a voter just a few weeks later. But here's the problem with that.
So there was no real rationale in the way that these early states were initially determined.
Iowa goes first because in 1972, the first election after the changes, Iowa said they needed a long time to compile their results, so they had to hold their caucus early. And as it's held on to that first spot, Iowa's gotten more and more important. And New Hampshire is the first traditional primary because they have a law saying that they have to be first. Yep, that's it. And the questions around whether these states should go first are not new.
The main problem that people bring up over and over again is that both states are super white. When you look at the actual numeric breakdown, both are about 90% white. So neither of these states is very representative of either the US or the party itself, and that's become a huge concern.
That's partly why in 2008, the parties moved 2 more diverse states, Nevada and South Carolina, to also be early in the calendar. Then there's Super Tuesday, which started in the 80s when southern states decided to have their primaries at the same time to try to have a bit more influence. Over the years, Super Tuesday has gotten more and more super. In 2020, 1/3 of all delegates will be awarded on this one day. In other words, Super Tuesday has been looking more and more like a national primary. So why not just have a national primary and have everyone vote on the same day? The answer has to do with who would probably win.
If there was a national primary today, whoever has the most money as well as the most name recognition would probably do the best because they're able to reach people and they already have an established backing in place.
Think about that in terms of the 2020 primary. If everyone voted on one day and money and name recognition mattered the most, this is who would probably come out on top. Remember that poll from December 2007? If everyone voted at once, Obama would have lost. Which brings us back to Iowa and New Hampshire.
I won Iowa because I spent 87 days going to every small town and fair and fish fry.
Both Iowa and New Hampshire, they're very accessible, so you can drive around, you can hold events, you can go to the fair and meet with voters, and also their media markets are much cheaper than other larger states like California. Both of those factors make it easier for a candidate who maybe isn't that well known to also make the same type of impression of somebody else who might be, wealthier and more well-resourced.
So the sequential system helps narrow the field, and starting in a small state can help underdog candidates emerge. But should that state be Iowa?
Why start in Iowa?
Well, that's the conversation that will absolutely happen after this election cycle.
There have been a bunch of different options floated. One is to change the state that goes first.
So which state should go first? The website 538 tried to figure this out by looking at the racial, ethnic, and educational breakdown of every state to find which one was most representative of the Democratic Party as a whole. Number 1 was Illinois. Iowa was 42nd.
Another option is to actually just move it so that 10 states go in February. That kind of dilutes the influence of Iowa and New Hampshire a little bit. And then another possibility is the idea of rotating. They've talked more about rotating regions that would dominate the primary one year and a different region that would dominate the primary a different year.
The way America nominates its presidential candidates isn't set in stone. The political parties can and have changed the process over the years. But it's been a while. Maybe it's time.
Our video mentioned
Sorry,
let me get through that real quick. The delegates that are available on any given day or any given day or month or something like that. So what we're looking at here are the breakdowns that first off, the Republican Party has on the number of delegates that each state is awarded, and we can see that more populated states like California and Texas are going to have a larger number of delegates relative to smaller states like Maine or Montana. These smaller states with fewer people in them are not going to be as influential. Again, each party runs their own primaries. They run their own caucuses and their own nomination process. And so the Republicans have this number of delegates based on however they calculated it. Democrats, on the other hand, they have this many that they need. So over 1900. So they calculate these things in different ways. And again, we see larger states, California and Texas, with higher percentages of the overall number of delegates that are offered. These delegates are the folks who, when the when the National Republican Convention meets, or when the Democratic National Party Convention meets, it's these delegates that go and vote on behalf of the voters in Texas, on behalf of the voters in Alaska. So rather than having all of us on one single day say, okay, this is the person we want, these delegates do that on our behalf, right? And having this primary system that takes place over a span of several months really allows folks to kind of get an idea of a candidate, get an idea of what they say in different circumstances, different on different topics. As events arise, they're allowed to kind of weigh in and give their thoughts on that particular event, right? Whatever it might be. So this is all designed to get the best possible candidate that's available, the one that most people will support for either the Republicans or the Democrats, whichever party you're looking at. Now, it mentioned the video itself mentioned this concept of Super Tuesday, and again, Super Tuesday, it changes from cycle to cycle. The states involved change from cycle to cycle. Prior to Super Tuesday, though, in the 2020 presidential election cycle, here are the delegate counts. So this is pretty early in, and the two front runners, Sanders and Biden, were essentially tied. Nowhere near the almost 2,000 delegates that they were going to need to get the nominee itself. On Super Tuesday, we see the breakdown here. Joe Biden won most of the states that were up for that held their primaries on these particular days. One thing that really helped them was a number of the other front runners dropped out right before this took place. To look quickly at these numbers, right? We see Biden in all these purple states, quote unquote, winning the states. But if we look at some of the numbers, we see, Biden got majority in Virginia, he got a majority in Alabama, but for the most part, Biden didn't win majorities in any of these states. And if we look at the rest of the states, that carries through as well. And we see Texas here, where Biden won almost 34% of the vote, and Sanders won 30%. So even after Super Tuesday, even after all of these states were kind of weighing in, the fact that Joe Biden was going to become the nominee was by no means guaranteed. It wasn't locked in, right? Because there was still a huge number of people that were supporting Bernie Sanders in particular at this point in time. Currently, this was updated as of just a few days ago. Joe Biden he has earned enough of these delegates to become the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, and by all expectations are that he will be the Democratic nominee, and he's even referring to himself as such, right? On the Republican side, Donald Trump did not have a whole lot of real opposition. So to date, he has won all of the delegate votes that have been up for grabs in all the states that have held Republican primaries. The only outlier here is Bill Weld. He is the Libertarian candidate, and he picked up one delegate in the Iowa caucus, so the very, very first one that took place. He got a little traction there, but he's since dropped out of the race and said, not going to take away attention or anything like that. So from the very start, as is often the case with an incumbent seeking re-election, that incumbent almost always gets the party support again, and we're seeing that taking place for the Republicans and Donald Trump. So come November, we will have a presidential ticket that has Donald Trump listed as the Republican candidate and Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. So what day is that election taking place? November 3rd. Don't forget, November 3rd. And if you want to vote, be sure to register. If you are going to be 18 by that point in time, you've got to get your paperwork postmarked. That means dropped into one of those big blue mailboxes, or handed off to your letter carrier, or dropped off at a mailbox, at the post office by October 5th. If it's not postmarked by that day, you will not get to vote in the November election. No way around it. Not going to happen. So November 3rd is the election. Register by October 5th. And the question is, why do we care? Well, I've touched on this already, right? This particular election, the presidential election, is has become the most important single election, in large part because whoever wins this, as we talked about with the six hats from Clinton Rossiter, right? They become the face of the nation. They become the face of the party. They become a very powerful voice in the federal government as a whole. So again, while this is just a single race, and there's hundreds of other races, if not thousands, taking place, in fact, if not tens of thousands taking place all across the country for things like governors and senators and state representatives, all of those are very important as well. The presidential election is just kind of held in this separate arena, right? It's viewed differently simply because it is the only national election that takes place. The president is the only elected official who speaks on behalf of the entire United States, and the president has a very unique election process, first through popular vote by state and then through the Electoral College. The president is the only person who speaks on behalf of all of us. And so no matter where you are, right, attention is being given to this particular race because all across the country people are tuning in. They want to see what's going to happen here. So with that, vote, 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 vote. Don't also just assume that one person or the other is going to be your candidate. Do some research, read a bunch of articles from a bunch of different websites, watch their behavior in different situations, different circumstances. And this is true for both the presidential election as well as governors and representatives and senators and mayors and city council people and everybody, right? Every one of these elections is important. So please do your part. Otherwise, somebody else is going to do it for you, and you just lost your vote. So please, don't forget to register. Take care. Have a great rest of your day, guys.